They held it at RAINHILL in May this year, at the place where the age of the train was born. It celebrated a century and a half of intercity travel. People came to see it from every corner of the world, and they called it Rocket 150. Rocket 150 is a cavalcade to celebrate two great events in railway history: the RAINHILL trials of 1829 and the opening of the Liverpool-Manchester Railway in 1830. And the purpose of the trials was to find the locomotive engine best suited to pull the trains on the new Liverpool-Manchester Railway, and so provide what we would now call the first regular passenger intercity rail service in the world. Now, the trials was a competition. The prize was £500, which wasn't a fortune even in those days. But whoever won knew that he stood to get the contract for all the locomotives for the railway. And of course, the locomotive that won is the most famous locomotive in the world, Robert Stephenson's Rocket. And this is it, or rather, this is a replica of it. But you must not imagine that this means that this was easily produced out of a mould. This was very difficult to construct, and judging by the feverish activity on it today, is still as capricious and as very much a one-off creation as the original Rocket. Now, there are those who wish that Rocket had never won those trials, but I believe that it was right that it did, because Rocket was the locomotive which was able to be developed most rapidly and most extensively. And indeed, it provided really the foundation of steam locomotives for the next 100 years. But of course, it had rivals. To be precise, two rivals, only one of which seriously worried the Stephensons, Robert and George, and that was this locomotive, Sans-Pareil, and this too, incidentally, is a replica and very beautiful. Now, this locomotive had been built by a man called Timothy Hackworth, and Hackworth had worked for the Stephensons as an engineer and then got a job as locomotive superintendent on the Stockton and Darlington Railway. So he had a full-time job, he had 8 kids to feed and educate, but he still found time during the evenings to put together this magnificent locomotive. The trouble was he had to subcontract bits of work, he had to put things out to have them made for him, some of it to the Stephensons. And of course, when he failed in the trial, there were those afterwards who said there'd been a bit of sabotage. I don't believe a word of that myself. I think that in the end he produced a locomotive which was slightly too heavy for the job, which proved to have all sorts of problems, and which indeed, had it won, would have pointed the whole development of locomotives in the wrong direction, because really this was the last of its kind, whereas the Rocket was the first of its kind. Still, there was a third contender who was never really in with a chance. The T-Urn was the name that they gave it in the Stephenson camp, and you can see why, but its real name was Novelty. It had been built by two blokes in London called Braithwaite and Ericsson. Had only heard about the RAINHILL trials a few weeks before, and in fact they only had 7 weeks in which to make it. They had no experience of railways. They were used to building road engines, little things like fire engines. But they built it and they brought it to RAINHILL, and the public loved it. The public thought it was very pretty, and this is the one that they wanted to win, because I really think they thought of the Stephensons as the big bad wolves. However, Novelty wasn't up to the job. Perhaps it was too underpowered. It certainly wasn't by any means reliable enough. And I'm sad to report that this replica too has its problems. It too is underpowered and lightly sprung, and has even toppled off the track, and I fear that it may need a lift to RAINHILL. Alongside the 3 replicas was a collection of locomotives and trains, the like of which may never be seen all together again. They had come under their own steam from all over the country, many of them from the loving care of private preservation societies, all of them assembled to illuminate British railway history. And they came together at bold colliery sidings a few miles from RAINHILL for coal and water. So, some of the steam locomotives being prepared here for the Cavalcade are privately owned, but many have come from the National Railway Museum at York. Among them, this one, Evening Star, the last steam locomotive to be made for British Rail. It was built at Swindon in 1960, and it ran for only 5 years and has been preserved for 15 years. So already it's had 3 times its life as a relic. And on the footplate is the Chief Mechanical Engineer of the National Railway Museum, John Bellwood, with a lovely fire. I imagine that this one is much easier to maintain, of course. It's practically new than the old Victorian ones. Yes, they didn't take into consideration that the locomotive should look elegant, as was a major consideration with the Victorian locomotive engineers. In this case, it was ease of maintenance was of paramount importance, and the more
the items requiring major attention were made as accessible as possible.
Practically put them on the outside where the Victorians covered them like piano legs.
Oh yes, they were felt to be indecent in Victorian parts were the mechanisms of the
When you're maintaining the very old ones, so what's the most difficult thing? I mean, the mechanical thing, or making it match, getting paint back, you know, making it look as it looked in its early days?
Well, it's a combination. One of the major problems is when we maintain an old locomotive in running condition, because we have to compromise to meet present-day safety regulations and requirements, which are much more stringent than they were 50 or 100 years ago.
So even at the museum at York, all the time you're thinking of getting them out and using them?
Yes, not every one of them, but the idea is to always have a representative selection of locomotives, usually unique ones.
Yeah.
We don't like to duplicate locomotives of types that, say, the private preservation movement are running on their lines. But we have, of course, many unique locomotives in the national collection, and those are the ones which we concentrate on.
Well, now, I've always wanted to know how you drive one, and now seems to be the opportunity. Is the steam up, if that's the right expression?
Yes, the pressure gauge there shows that we've got about 100 pounds of steam, which is enough just to move the locomotive on its own, but when we would be working a train, we'd like in excess of 200 pounds per square inch pressure.
Good, so what do we do?
Well, there are three major controls. There's the regulator here, and this controls the flow of steam from the boiler into the cylinders to move the pistons to turn the wheels.
Yes.
There's the reversing gear here, which determines whether the locomotive goes forward or backwards, but also allows you to use the steam expansively, and that means that it can be used much more economically, use much less coal, much less water, which gives a longer range of operation of the locomotive. And then, of course, the paramount importance, having started the thing, you've got to stop it, so you've got the brake. The locomotive itself has got a steam brake, which is operated by this, but also to enable it to work vacuum-braked vehicles, that's carriages or wagons, it has a vacuum brake. And when it's on one of those trains, by operating the vacuum brake handle here, you proportionally apply the steam brake on the locomotive.
Do you think George Stephenson would have understood all that?
Oh, I think so. I mean, I think George Stephenson was pioneering so much that this would be child's play to him, was he living today.
And is it true that the firemen used to cook their breakfast on a shovel?
Yes, I'm told it is. I've never actually seen it done, but I'm assured by many driver friends of mine that it was a regular feature.
You know, I think I'll have a go at that, but John, thank you very much indeed. Apparently, to make his breakfast, the fireman used to clean his shovel with a slacker pipe, which sort of wastes steam. That made it hot, melted his fat on that, and then popped on his bacon and eggs and his sausage. Then all he had to do, you see, was open the fire door, stick it in and cook it. And on a good roaring fire, I mean, it was in and out in seconds, and no doubt straight down his mouth. I'm not sure that I'll eat it, though. I don't really think I fancy the taste of coal dust. It's going beautifully. Anyway, it's high time we moved away from firemen and locomotives to what they pulled, to the rolling stock. And I have with me another member of the National Railway Museum, the Education Officer, David Jenkins.
Well, I'm now standing inside the kitchen of one of the oldest preserved dining cars in Britain. It was built in the year 1900 by the London and North Western Railway, right at the height of the late Victorian, early Edwardian era of railways. It's not a very big kitchen, but it could cook a prodigious amount of food. Behind me here is a 12-ring stove, so you could have at least a dozen or more pans going strongly on here, and to my right here there are two huge ovens, each of which could hold at least a 30-pound turkey. This was because this kitchen had to supply food for probably 50 people at a sitting and 2 sittings at a time. And when the food was cooked, it was brought to the door of the kitchen, handed to the waiter, who then had to negotiate his way along a rather narrow corridor, which we're now going down. There was a butler's pantry on the right, and then, of course, he would come out into the main dining saloon, which is a good deal more elegant place than the kitchen itself. And when you sat down, there was a prodigious amount of room. For this was the elegance of a first-class dining carriage of 80 years ago. One simply surrounded by the opulence of the period. Beautiful maquette, upholstery, plenty of room to shuffle around if you're a little on the portly side, as I am. Gorgeous inlaid mosaic and marquetry work in the woodwork, and even the tableware is worth a second look. How about this for a coffee pot, for instance, after you'd had your meal? Even the crockery itself is gold banded and marked with the actual device of the railway on which it ran. This one is in fact the London North and North Western Railway. And of course the Liverpool and Manchester itself became part of the London and North Western Railway. Upon my right we have wine bottle holders. Not just ordinary bits of metal or anything like that, but even these too are inlaid with woodwork. In fact, this dining car was so good that when it was built in 1900, before it was put into service, the railway sent it to Paris on exhibition, where it won a Grand Prix. And it wasn't long after it came back to Britain that it was given a very different utilisation altogether. In fact, it was taken out of regular service and put to use in the British Royal train. And if we move along to the other part of the vehicle, we can see exactly the alterations that were made. Well, originally this saloon, like the one next door, was arranged with fixed seating, but as you can see, it's very different now. The reason is that in 1901, when King Edward VII came to the throne, the railways built him a new royal train. Now, his mother, Queen Victoria, didn't like eating on the railway trains at all, but King Edward was a very different monarch to Queen Victoria. And it wasn't long before he wanted dining facilities on his royal train. And so, at a date which is not totally certain, this vehicle was altered from the arrangement we've seen to this open saloon with its individual dining chairs. Nothing much was changed in terms of decor, except for the insertion of new woodwork where the fixed seating was removed. And the new chairs were made specially for the occasion. The table could be arranged for any number of people from 2 or 3 up to 8, and we've got it laid out for 6, with the places staggered so that the customers had a little bit more room to partake of their meal. Well, when we sit down at this particular table, we discover that the silverware is much as we'd expect. But the crockery is a bit different, because it's a special blue-banded variety that was only used on the royal trains, and as far as I know, this particular pattern is still in use on the current Royal Train service. Now, as I said, the number of people could dine in this vehicle varied from 3 or 4 to 8, but we've been told that when the Queen was travelling, and this vehicle was used by the present Queen as recently as 1956, she always occupied the chair diagonally opposite on my left. And the vehicle itself didn't come into the museum collection until not much more than 20 years ago, so it's had a long and honourable life. For many years it was retired and just on public view, but last year we took the opportunity to thoroughly overhaul it and put it into full running order again, and as recently as last September, this old dining car, 79 years old, helped to commemorate the centenary of railway catering by travelling 2,500 miles round Britain with people sitting at these very seats eating meals.
The spectators gathered by the thousands, every bit as agog as the people who came to this very same site 150 years ago to witness the RAINHILL trials. But now, as then, back along the track, not everything was going to plan. On the first day, Rocket, which should have led the cavalcade, fell off the track as it left Bowl Colliery and failed to appear before the crowd. On the second day, Rocket did run, but it wasn't the first locomotive to come into sight. Now an example of mid-Victorian elegance, a reminder of how rapidly locomotives became things of beauty. This is a Midland spinner, but spinner's a nickname, isn't it, David, not a name?
Yes, it is. In fact, the name is described as having arisen from one of 2 possibilities. One, that they seem to spin along effortlessly with a large driving wheel with apparently nothing to make it turn at all. Of course, all the machinery is inside. The other was less complimentary. It suggested that it slipped its wheels when it was trying to pull a heavy load. But this is an elegant locomotive.
Did the big wheel remain in favour for a long time?
Well, it had 2 sessions. In the early days, they used single-driver locomotives. Then they went out of fashion. And then the sanding gear, which is the pipe below the wheel, enabled them to come back into favour when you could blow sand under the wheel.
It is also, of course, a very elegant Midland livery.
Yes, this was introduced in the 1880s by the man who designed this locomotive, Samuel Johnson, and it became the real trademark of the Midland Railway Company. And that colour scheme lasted until the 1960s, before it finally disappeared from the railways of Britain.
And this, of course, is one from your museum.
Well, it's one from our museum, but one that's been on loan to the Midland Railway Trust at Butterley. Several of the engines that we own in this display are not actually located at York, and this is one of them.
Well, now we turn to a lovely little one. Hasn't got a name. I think it's always sad when locomotives have no names, but of course the enthusiasts, in fact, always know them by the numbers anyway. Even when they have a name, they tend to refer to them by number. This one, 752, I suppose a typical shunter.
Yes, from the Lancashire and Yorkshire Railway, so very much a local machine built by Bear Peacock in Manchester. So very, very strong local connections with this one. And a typical made-of-all work, built in the 1880s and used throughout, as its name implies, the Lancashire and Yorkshire territory. I think I'm right in saying this one started off as a tender locomotive but was later fitted with this saddle tank so that it didn't need to have its coal and water supply separate. And a tank locomotive is very useful because, as you can see, it's much more compact.
And now a very famous and beautiful locomotive, the Hardwick, which has already made its mark this weekend by carrying the official party to the opening. And I think it's still drawing the same beautiful coaches, isn't it?
Yes, I hope you don't mind me saying, but I think we at the museum are very proud of this particular collection of locomotive and carriages. The carriages are from the old Royal train. They're not the Royal saloons, they are some of the supporting vehicles, including the dining car. And Hardwick, of course, the very famous racing locomotive of the 1890s. And this is what the trains of the London and North Western Railway used to look like until 1923, when the railway became part of the London, Midland and Scottish group.
Yes, Hardwick was one that used to take part in those races up to Aberdeen, but by the West Coast route.
That's right. The carriages are in the dark red and white colour scheme of the London and North Western, but they're carrying London, Midland and Scottish badges because the running gear is rather more modern than the bodies, and that's why they've managed to survive so long.
Now, I think you did tell me that this one is still capable of about 70 miles an hour.
If it were allowed to do so, I'm quite sure of it, Brian, but 60 miles an hour is the normal limit for steam locomotives allowed to run on British Rail.
Today, of course, they're all going at 10 miles an hour so that everyone can have a good look.
Yes, indeed. But can you imagine the time when dozens of them looked like this, and every carriage you saw in Liverpool, Lime Street or Manchester would look like these?
Now, although much more modest a locomotive than Hardwick, this little one, I gather, was designed by the same man.
Yes, indeed. And you can probably see that it's painted in the same colour scheme and generally got similar visual lines. These are much more humdrum, if that's the right word to use, but my goodness me, they did some work in their time. They were called coal tanks because they were derived from a rather similar engine that carried a separate tender called a coal engine. And they did goods workings, they pulled passenger trains, they were real maids of all work. And for a long, long period of time, this one survived well into the period beyond the Second World War.
Now, this is Maud, not named after the lady who was reluctant to come into the garden, but after the general. This is Maud with an E at the end, and in fact Scottish, David.
Yes, this is a Scottish pairing. In fact, you might almost call it a marriage of our enemies, because the locomotive comes from the North British Railway, but the carriage from the Caledonian Railway, which was the great rival of the North British. It's rather nice to see them having buried their differences today, and they both come from Scotland.
And they don't belong to your museum?
No, they don't. Although I wouldn't say I wouldn't mind them if they did. But Maud is a typical British goods locomotive. 6 coupled wheels and a tender behind it. And they were used all over the country for routine freight haulage.
She looks almost too beautiful for a job like that. You'd expect her to pull passenger coaches.
I've no doubt from time to time engines like this did.
We describe them as Scottish, but they would journey south across the border in the course of their working lives.
Yes, indeed, and I think this particular one actually went overseas in the First World War, and those that went overseas, when they came back, were given names to commemorate events of that conflict, including this one.
Hence Maud.
Hence Maud, yes.
Now, a Midland compound. Compound always sounds like the name of a place where locomotives might gather, but in fact, what does it mean?
Well, it's a term used to denote the way in which the steam is used in the locomotive. Most steam locomotives in Britain are what we call simple. That is, the steam is used once in the cylinders and then exhausts through the chimney up to atmosphere. But in a compound locomotive, the steam passes through a high-pressure cylinder and then into a lower-pressure cylinder before it goes through the chimney. So it's called compound use of steam.
A very memorable number, isn't it, that one?
Yes, indeed. This was the very first Midland compound to be built in 1902, and it was rebuilt to this shape in 1914. And the carriage it's pulling, the dining car, was also built in 1914, so it's an exact contemporary pairing from the same railway.
And typical of the Midland, even the third-class dining car is very elegant.
Yes, the Midland was a great pioneer in third-class railway travel. It forced many of the other railways to follow suit or lose customers, and we're very pleased to have this particular pair in the museum at York, because they do represent all that was best about Edwardian and travel of that time.
The emancipation of the lower orders.
Indeed. And why not?
And now a train from the south, from Somerset and Dorset, indeed, from the West Country. I think it might be a moment, David, to talk about the coming together of all the private railway lines into the Great Four. When was that, 1923?
Yes, it was 1923. This is in fact a very good engine to illustrate this point, because it was built for a joint line, the Somerset and Dorset, which was jointly owned between the Midland and the London and South Western. And in 1923, those two railways became part of the London, Midland and Scottish and the Southern. The Somerset and Dorset kept its identity for a few more years, but eventually its locomotives were absorbed by the London, Midland and Scottish, so there you see a Somerset and Dorset engine carrying the LMS lettering. It's very much in the same family as the Midland compound, except that the outside valve gear suggests that it's of a more modern type.
Many people, I imagine, will remember Pines Express.
Yes, indeed.
Now, this little goods engine is one of very many.
Yes, what we call the 060, that is the no small wheels at the front, 6 driving wheels and no carrying wheels at the back, must be the most typical of all British wheel arrangements during much of the steam period. And there were 772 of these built. They were designed by the Midland Railway, but after the Great Amalgamation of 1923, the LMS Railway continued to build them, right until 1941, as a matter of fact.
Yes, they had these from 1911 to 1941,
yes,
with virtually very little change.
Very little change of any great notes. They weren't particularly sophisticated, and many people would say that they were not the most efficient, but their sheer numbers and their fairly cheap to maintain nature, they probably earned their dividends over the years, yes.
Now, here's an example of an even more numerous locomotive, but even more interesting, of course, is the train that it is pulling.
Well, yes, this is really what the railways were all about, Brian. The ubiquitous, made-of-all-work, mixed-traffic locomotive at the front. There were 842 of these built between 1934 and 1950. Perhaps the most successful mixed-traffic engine ever introduced onto the railways of Britain. And they pulled virtually every sort of train, from express passenger to local goods trains. But the only thing they couldn't put them in front of was the streamlined expresses of the 30s. And the vehicles behind it are a real mixture of the sort of trucks that were to be seen all over the country behind freight trains for a long, long period of time.
In the days when we still called them goods trains.
Indeed, goods trains, although some railways, including the LMS, did tend to refer to them latterly as freight.
But even more important, look what it's carrying.
Yes, it's the leading vehicle is, of course, a brake van, but behind it we've got 2 well trolleys.
And sitting on it, Novelty.
Novelty, yes. I'm glad it's here. It's a very interesting way of displaying this locomotive, with its wheels chopped up, so that you can see them turning.
Of course, everyone had hoped this replica of Novelty, which was one of the 3 that took part in the trials here at Rainhill in 1829, would run under its own steam on the track. But I explained on Friday in the programme that we put out on Saturday that, in fact, it turned out to be underpowered and a little lightly sprung and kept toppling off the track. So rather than it not have its place in the cavalcade, they popped it on this van to bring it along. You can see exactly why they called it the T-Hern. And this engine?
Yes, this is the narrow gauge locomotive Earl from the Welsh Pool and Llanfair Railway, which is on loan to us at the museum, and we're carrying it on a well trolley to allow it to clear the bridges. The idea is you depress the centre of the vehicle to allow a larger object to travel loaded on another vehicle. And behind that, of course, are a couple of cattle wagons, representing the time when livestock was carried by rail in very large quantities. You might like to know these are the very last 2 cattle trucks that ever carried livestock in this form on the railways of Britain. And the railways let us have them when they'd finished with them.
Apologies to Welsh listeners, make sure I get it right. I think Dryslewin Castle. This is the first of the Great Western locomotives that we've seen.
Yes, so far most of the parade has been of the London, Midland and Scottish and its constituent companies, but this is the famous Great Western, and what a magnificent turnout this particular combination of locomotive and carriages is. Great tribute to the private preservation movement, the locomotive from the Didcot Group and the carriages from the Severn Valley Railway.
What was the significance of the Castle class?
Well, it was one in a great line of Great Western locomotives, evolved from a period just after the turn of the century right through to the 20s and 30s. The Castles date from 1923 and led in turn to the famous King type and via Williams Tannier to even more developments on the London, Midland and Scottish Railway. So they really are in the mainstream of British locomotive development, and it's great to see such a beautifully restored example here today.
There you are, Dryslewin.
Lots of polished brass. This was, of course, the trademark of the Great Western, copper and brass. And this rich dark green colour. And the chocolate and cream of the carriages, of course, was another very familiar Great Western sight.
These carriages, though, are slightly younger than that locomotive.
Yes, I think both of them are. The leading one is a post-war vehicle, post-Second World War. The trailing vehicle is from the 30s, but they have been magnificently restored by the Severn Valley Railway, who own them. A credit to anyone, and I certainly wouldn't mind them in our museum at York if they came our way.
And now we move to Southern Railway and a locomotive called Cheltenham. I think the last of the 440s, wasn't it?
Yes, indeed. The 440, which is 4 carrying wheels at the front and 4 driving wheels behind it, was very common late Victorian Edwardian design. But this one appeared during the period after the 1923 amalgamations and was designed and built on the Southern Railway to take trains down to Bournemouth and places like that.
Now that is a very post-war green.
Yes, this is one from our collection in York that we've just finished restoring. We have several locomotives from the Southern Railway, so we've tried to put them in different colour schemes appropriate to the design, and we've chosen the immediate post-Second World War colour scheme for this one, and the green is called malachite green. It's a very bright shade indeed.
That was the final colour that Southern Region used,
yes,
wasn't it, before it became British Rail?
Yes, indeed, and the electric trains continue to carry this colour, although not with quite this amount of decoration, well into the British Railways period. We expect that this one will go into the, as it were, fleet of mainline approved steam locomotives for excursion work when she gets back to York.
Well, there cannot be a marshalling yard or a major siding anywhere in the country that hasn't seen one of these locomotives. They're almost the typical shunting. Yes?
Yes, you can't really get much more typical than this. It's a tank engine. Again, to repeat, this is because it carries its water in a tank at the side and the coal in a bunker. It doesn't have a separate tender. And they were used for shunting in marshalling yards, the forerunners of the modern diesel shunters.
Well, if little Ginty'd been busy, so too has Robert, because Robert belongs to Bold Colliery, to the coalboard there, which is where all the locomotives and coaches in this cavalcade have been assembled over these last few days. And Robert, in fact, is a working engineer, works every day, even though he's immaculate.
Yes, this reminds you that there were, of the time when many industrial plants had these little shunting tank engines in their warehouse yards and so on to handle the internal traffic, and they were often given gaily decorated colour schemes and elaborate names, some far more elaborate than Robert.
He must have been designed, what, during the Second World War?
Yes, it's an austerity design, I think one could say. It was designed for cheapness of construction, and there were many like this built during the Second World War, and quite a number of them preserved, as well as this one, of course, which is not only preserved, but in fact still doing its proper job.
And now we turn to one that everyone says is very ugly, which seems a bit unkind. I think the reason is that it had most of its works on the outside rather than the inside.
Yes, it's a little bit out of sequence historically with some of the ones we've been seeing, but this represents the sort of post-war attempt to try and cheapen the maintenance of locomotives by making it easier to get at all the various moving parts, and that meant bringing them to the outside.
Post which war?
The Second World War. And of course, this would really have shocked the Victorians to see all this moving machinery. They liked their locomotives nice and simple and neat, with everything discreetly hidden away below their skirts.
And this is what, a post-war parcel van?
Yes, a vehicle used for parcels or mail and things like that. Basically equivalent to a passenger carriage without any seats in it, so that you just fill it with luggage and so on, and it can travel at the normal passenger train speed. And you will see these in trains perhaps a dozen at a time, running at very high speeds.
And now we have another Great Western, one I think again belonging to the Severn Valley people. Characteristic 0601.
Yes, yet again, a characteristic goods engine. It has a tapered boiler, that is, it's smaller at the front than at the back, which is very much a Great Western trademark. It later became an LMS trademark as well. But it shows the simplicity of the external shape of the earlier type of locomotive, far less moving machinery visible on this one.
And now Gordon, named after a general, and very appropriately, because this is very much in every sense a wartime locomotive.
Yes, it was designed as a utility heavy freight type for military traffic, particularly during the Second World War. Many of these were built and most of them were shipped overseas. This particular one was kept in this country for training military personnel in driving and maintaining steam locomotives, because of course the military drove their own trains in overseas theatres, and naturally enough it's bulled up in true military style.
They blancoed the wheels by the look of it.
Yes, very nearly that.
And it's still really in its sort of military uniform, isn't it?
Yes, indeed. It's preserved on the Severn Valley, but in its military colour scheme. The LMR stands for Longmoor Military Railway.
And during the War Department was actually the owner of locomotives.
Yes,
not the railway companies.
Yes, they were built by contractors and others, and frequently known as WD locomotives because of their association with the War Department.
I suppose we ought to say we've turned now to the Navy, because this one is named after Lord Nelson. But it's what, a 1920s Southern Railway?
Yes, it's somewhat contemporary with the Great Western Castle type, a little bit later. And it's a four-cylinder engine like the Great Western Castle. That is two cylinders on the outside, which you can see, and two more tucked away under the smoke box. This was part of the move towards producing more powerful steam locomotives in the 1920s. This one was modified, extensively modified at the front end, as we say, by a later engineer in the 1930s, and we've given this one its colour scheme of the 1938 period.
This isn't the malachite green.
No, this is a slightly earlier version of the Southern Green. Some people still call this version malachite. It's an even brighter green than Cheltenham.
Now they're coming in the lovely Midland livery. Red, I always think of it, but Lake, I think, is the name everyone uses. Leander.
Yes, the LMS adopted Midland Lake, as we call it, as its colour scheme for its more important express engines, and here's one of them from the 30s, designed by William Stanier, who came to the LMS from the Great Western Railway, and you've got the tapered boiler, which was very much the feature of Great Western engines too.
Well, Stanier was the great designer of the trains that went up the west coast, wasn't he?
Yeah, that's right. And this locomotive is coupled to a dynamometer car from our collection at York, which is a testing vehicle used for evaluating locomotive performance. And it's full of equipment and gadgets to enable the coal consumption, water consumption, drawbar pull, and many other technical details. And through the window you can see the very elaborate recording equipment and the rolls of paper on which the traces were made by moving pens as the locomotive was tested.
I must also mention, though, the one behind, which is a griddle car, if I recognise it rightly, the kind they have in Scotland, where you could drink at one end and eat at the other. Now, we've talked of Stanier, the West Coast designer, and we turn to Gresley, the East Coast designer, because this is a Gresley locomotive, Green Arrow.
Yes, this is the first of 3 Gresley engines in this parade. We've seen the Great Western contribution and the Southern contribution. We now have a trio of very famous London and North Eastern locomotives, led off by Green Arrow, a very substantial mixed traffic design, pulling 2 very typical London and North Eastern coaches in the varnished teak, which was an alternative colour decoration to paintwork.
Very beautiful too. Did Gresley design the coaches as well as the locomotives?
Yes, Gresley in fact started his life as a carriage designer, and the second vehicle in this train was one of the very earliest Gresley vehicles ever to be built. It dates from 1908, and you can see from the shape of it that he got a very modern shape as early as that, and it didn't change much for the next 30 years. And it became very much a feature of East Coast trains, especially in your neck of the woods, Brian.
Yeah. Used to stand on the castle at Newcastle as a child. We could look down on that marvellous crossing. See nothing but trains like this going past. Well, now, the next one, too, must be Gresley, is it, or not?
Oh, yes. This must be one of the most famous locomotives in the business. It's Flying Scotsman.
Of course.
Very similar in visual lines to Green Arrow, but an extra pair of wheels at the front. This is a 462, whereas Green Arrow is a 262.
Now, why do you think Flying Scotsman has become so famous?
I think partly because of the racy look of the locomotive. You can feel it going quickly, even though it's only moving quite slowly, because it's such a beautifully graceful design. Also, its name commemorates the 10 o'clock train from King's Cross to Scotland, which has been called the Flying Scotsman for over a century. And this was, of course, a high-speed train, even before the days of the modern railway.
So they named the service, did they, before they named an engine to run the service?
Indeed they did, and this causes great confusion, because there is still a Flying Scotsman train, the 10 o'clock from King's Cross.
It doesn't go non-stop now, though, does it? Doesn't it stop at Newcastle, or did the Flying Scotsman always stop at Newcastle?
The Flying Scotsman started by stopping at several places. It became a non-stop train when the corridor tenders were fitted to this very type of locomotive. In fact, Flying Scotsman has a corridor tender, so that the crew could change partway through the journey by passing through the tender from the carriages. At the back of the tender there's a sort of corridor connection which enables them to get into the train. You can see it there.
Now, this one is unmistakably a Gresley. It not only has the stamp of Gresley, it has his name on it, because this is the Sir Nigel Gresley. I suppose representative, what, of the fastest train in the world?
Yes, the class was the fastest steam locomotive in the world. Mallard, of course, at the Railway Museum at York. This is, in fact, the post-World War II steam record holder, having achieved 112 miles an hour. It's effectively a streamlined version of the Flying Scotsman type, with slight modifications at the cylinders, but essentially it's an engine like Flying Scotsman, but with this glamorous streamlined casing.
Because there are those enthusiasts who don't like the streamlining, who like to see the steam locomotives looking more unmistakably, boilers. But I think I remember when Silver Jubilee, for instance, first went through Newcastle, we were all ecstatic.
Yes, originally, of course, the wheels on this locomotive were covered up by flat metal plates, but at a later stage, the flat metal plates were removed to allow access to the working parts.
Good indication there of the steam age as everything disappeared.
The chime whistle, it was quite unique to these locomotives. Most LNER locomotives had a quite high-pitched whistle, but this beautiful two-tone chime, slightly American in sound, identified itself instantly to enthusiasts down the East Coast main line. When you heard that whistle, you knew what was coming.
Now, there are those, of course, who would say that this actually represents the sort of epitome of the British steam express train, would you?
Yes, this particular class, and one we shall shortly be seeing, certainly represent the high point of British express passenger steam. Its only real rival, I think, is the equivalent Stanier locomotive, the Duchess type, which we shall be seeing very soon.
Also those who would say it clearly indicates why we had a Clean Air Act.
Yes, well, that's a point too.
course, is at the farm wall, where they're going to be going into the highway. So the Cumbria Coast Express is one, the Cumbria Mountain Express is another, and this car,
Now this combination is a feast, a famous service, Golden Arrow, a famous locomotive clan line, and the pulling three magnificent Pullman cars.
Yes, this is really quite a collection, isn't it? The locomotive was designed by a man who started life as Gresley's assistant on the LNER, a man called Oliver Bulleid. It was streamlined when it was originally built, and then later had the streamlined casings removed to reveal underneath a perfectly conventional shaped locomotive. Very popular they became. This one is privately preserved by the Clan Line Association, and the carriages that the train is pulling are a representative collection of Pullmans rather than typical of the Golden Arrow service. This one, for instance, Audrey, is one of the old Brighton Bell cars, and would be normally have been found as one of the carriages in the middle of the Brighton Bell electric trains. The first carriage, Topaz, is from our collection in York, and is
Very old, that one.
Yes, 1913, and the sort that used to go down to the south coast from places like Victoria. The figures in the leading compartment are wax dummies in period costume that we normally have on show in the museum.
And Emerald at the back.
Emerald at the back is a very much more modern carriage of a type built as recently as 1960 for use on the East Coast services between London and Yorkshire and London and the North East. In fact, the Tees-Tyne Pullman, I dare say you've travelled on more than once, would have this sort of carriage on it.
Yes, it did, and it had those lovely little lamps with little shades on. I think that's one of the things that people lament the passing of most, isn't it, the Pullman? After all, there's only one left now, the Manchester Pullman, and nowhere else.
Yes, I think the problem is that to get that degree of luxury, you can't put as many seats in the train, and therefore it begins to become a very costly exercise.
Well, now an opportunity to dwell on one of the great Stanier locomotives from the LMS, Princess Elizabeth.
Yes, this is in effect the LMS answer to the Flying Scotsman type of locomotive. Princess Elizabeth was the second Stanier 462 to be built, and in 1936 put up a non-stop record run from London to Glasgow in record time, and came back the following day even faster. And
were Stanier and Gresley great rivals or great friends in their rivalry?
They were rivals in the sense that their railways were in competition, and the enthusiast, of course, has perpetuated this rivalry, but they were in fact close personal friends and consulted each other and took advice from each other.
Now, this train is pulling two carriages, I think one from the 20s and one from, what, 20 years later?
Yes, the first vehicle is one from our collection at York and is a restored third-class sleeping carriage, or rather convertible sleeping carriage. That is, its compartments can be used during the day for normal travelling, and then you can fold them up into bunks at night, and it still carries all the full lining and decoration of the period of the First World War and afterwards. But the second vehicle is a much smoother sided type. It's got pressed steel panels on a wooden frame, a much simpler style of painting altogether, indicative of the change that took place between the 20s and the later 30s and 1940s. And this second vehicle is a privately owned one from the Severn Valley Railway. And I think the pair of them together really sort of encapsulate the changing look of an express train between the 20s and the 1930s and 40s.
I have a sneaking suspicion that most people will prefer the 20s.
I think in visual terms, there's no doubt at all. That really is a handsome vehicle. But knowing the problems of restoring it, to get all that fancy woodwork and all the decoration done correctly is quite a difficult process. And I think the flush-sided vehicle, such as the second one here, is a much easier proposition when labour becomes expensive.
With the keenest possible anticipation, the return to steam on the main line of one of the LMS Duchesses, and this is Duchess of Hamilton coming along now.
And now very recently restored, and I think one of the prides of York, isn't it? The Duchess of Hamilton.
Yes, I think these have been described as the most majestic steam locomotives ever built in Britain. They were originally streamlined, rather like Sir Nigel Gresley, not quite the same shape, but the LMS, in its wisdom, some would say, removed the streamlined casings to reveal this very handsome brute underneath. Really the only rival to the Gresley Streamliner in terms of the final evolution of British steam.
But this was running right into British Rail time.
Yes, in fact, we've repainted it in its British Railways colour scheme, because this was a streamliner when it was owned by the LMS Railway. So we gave it back its BR colour scheme, which is, once again, the Midland Red, which survived, as I said, well into the modern day.
And this was running right up until we got into diesels.
Yes, these were replaced by the diesels. This one was withdrawn in 1963-4. In that time, they were the most powerful steam express type ever to run in Britain. Something over 3,000 horsepower at those cylinders could be developed with this particular type of locomotive.
And it's pulling?
It's pulling two modern BR carriages, which is quite appropriate for this particular decor scheme, because these were the first series of standard carriages built by British Rail during the 1950s, and the Duchesses would regularly be seen pulling 14 or 15 of these over Shap, Fell and Beatock and en route between London and Scotland, where they did most of their work on the West Coast Main Line.
Well, after that parade of great express locomotives, we turned back to a humble little tank engine, though it was whistling away very cockily there.
Yes, this is a standard design, that is one built after nationalisation of railways to a standard design, somewhat derived from pre-nationalisation designs. This is a largish passenger tank locomotive of a 2/6 four-wheel arrangement, 2 small wheels, 6 driving wheels and then 4 carrying wheels at the back.
What origins in the LMS, I imagine?
The LMS had a great number of them, and these probably owe more to the London, Midland and Scottish than to the other railways, though one of the features of the standard locomotives of the BR period was that they took features from the different railways that had been amalgamated in 1948. This one really shows what the best of the private groups can achieve in restoring what started life as pretty well a piece of hulking, rusting, mouldering iron when it was rescued from the scrap heap. This one comes again from the Severn Valley, who've made a magnificent contribution to this parade.
Now, this one I know very well. This is Evening Star, most appropriately named because the last of the steam engines built for British Rail.
Yes, the last of the line, and what an appropriate name. Built at Swindon, the former Great Western Works, and given a lot of Swindon trimmings because it was such a special engine. So it has the Swindon colour, the Swindon green, it has the Swindon copper top to its chimney, and lots of polished pipework.
Because even at the moment that they were building, they knew that its days were numbered.
Yes, indeed. It only ran for 5 or 6 years in revenue service before it was preserved for all time. It's derived actually from the 210 Nord of Gordon type. You remember the blue locomotive Gordon? Well, this was designed by the same man called Robert Riddles, and this derives from Gordon. Heavy freight job.
This is one you have at York, I know, but of course it must have been easier than the others to restore because it was practically new.
Well, indeed, it really is in railway terms a brand new locomotive. A 5-year-old steam locomotive is really a spring chicken in terms of the amount of mileage it's run.
Well, now we turn to the diesel age, and there will be 1 or 2 hearts that will sink and say it's not half as exciting as the steam age, but not the real enthusiast.
No, I think not, and this is a good example to illustrate the point, because this is a class of diesels which is already extinct on the railway. The Western region carried out a long experiment into diesel hydraulic propulsion as opposed to diesel electric. And one of the classes were the Westerns, all given names with Western associations. And this is one of them. Rather handsome, I think. The hooded cab shape and so on produced a very distinctive outline, and they gained a very, very strong following.
Oh yes, you can't accuse it of just being a box on wheels.
No, you can't. I think there's some very good design here, but they proved in the event not to be as cheap to maintain as a diesel electric, and therefore, in the interest of standardisation, the experiment was concluded and the class was withdrawn.
Now this one, making a noise not unlike Kojak travelling through New York, looks as though it's come to sweep up after all the others, but it has its own place in the cavalcade.
Yes, it reminds us that fundamental to the railway is its track, and this is a modern mechanical track tamping machine which takes over the job that used to be done by an army of navvies. Those vertical rods with the white plates at the bottom go down below the track and stir up the ballast in order that it can be properly drained and properly packed for to maintain the track in good order.
And now we move firmly into contemporary railways, because here we have a Class 25 diesel pulling a fine array.
Yes, I suppose you could say the Class 25 is the diesel equivalent of the Class 5 steam mixed traffic engine that we've seen already, and quite appropriately pulling a mixture of modern freight stock. There's a motor rail wagon with a protective screen over the top to avoid stone damage and vandal damage.
That's new, isn't it?
Yes, I believe it's an experimental vehicle. This is the first of its kind. I think they're going to try and make them with a higher roof so that you can get vehicles as big as a dormobile in them. The next vehicle, of course, it carries is the more conventional motor rail type of vehicle with simply a flat platform for the motor cars to ride on.
You get children on bridges throwing stones at your car.
Yes, I'm afraid that happens. Behind the motor rail wagon is a pallet van which has got very large sliding doors at the side so that loaded pallets can be put straight into it from forklift trucks, thus saving a certain amount of intermediate handling. Right at the back you've got a vast tank wagon of the type that is used for conveying liquids in huge quantities. And you notice it hasn't got a guards van. Modern freight trains don't need guards vans.
After Class 25, Class 45, but I fear just a wee bit anonymous.
Yes, this was one of the early standard designs. Shortly after the abandonment of steam, a large fleet of these big engines were built, and they were used on passenger and freight service. And here's a mixture of typical freight vehicles behind it.
Perhaps the most distinctive thing about the modern diesel is the noise it makes. This is Class, 47, I think, the most ubiquitous.
Yes, this is the standard BR heavy diesel locomotive type for passenger and freight. Over 500 of them built, and pulling modern car-carrying wagons, and perhaps even more interesting, the Freightliner vehicles, which of course are huge container vehicles with the international containers on them.
Even when they give a modern diesel a name, you see, it doesn't wholly disguise its anonymity. Here's a Class 55.
These were more commonly known as Deltics. These were the high-powered, high-speed locomotives that serviced the East Coast route after the A4s, and it's pulling two more electric locomotives. The modern Novelty, which is working out of Euston, the modern
Sansbury, yes.
There is one called Novelty, too, of the same type. I'm sorry, I got confused there. And the one behind is the Manchester, Sheffield and Wath type of earlier electric locomotive that runs through the Woodhead route between Manchester and Sheffield. This was on show at the Festival of Britain, that particular locomotive, and we've restored it into the condition in which it was on show on that memorable occasion.
But much more dramatic, and I think really the beginning of the new railway age, the HS 125, the fast diesel train.
Yes, this is only really half of the train, because they normally have 7 or 8 carriages between the power cars that are at each end. Very striking use of the new corporate image colours of British Rail, blue and grey, but with a lot of yellow at the front. And the brand name emblazoned on the side. Yes, we're into a new railway now, and they're very fine trains, and they're running on the western region between London and the west of England, and of course on the eastern region from King's Cross to Newcastle, Leeds and Edinburgh.
And even Gresley would have approved of that. But now the one that I'm sure old George Stephenson himself would most have wanted to see, the train of the future, the advanced passenger train, the one that can go fast round the bends. Sadly, because it's an electric train and this line is not electrified, it's having to be pushed here, but that doesn't mean that there's anything the matter with it at all. This is a prototype, one of 3 that they've built. Of course, when they're in regular service, they'll have more coaches, and they will be in regular service by the summer of '81. Euston to Glasgow. I might say that if they stop at Crewe, I shall take it home to Manchester every week. Those who designed it don't like people saying so, but it looks a bit like Concorde, I always imagined. But let's show you what it really can do on an electric line. Here you see it at high speed. Not at its full speed. It probably won't ever bother to go as fast as it could. It could get up to 150 or even 160 miles an hour. But it will be content to travel at 125. What will make it reduce the time for the journey is that when it comes to a bend like this, it can roll over and take the bend at the same speed. Look at that. It's like the Loch Ness Monster. design is proved, and soon, as I say, it will be in regular service, and we'll all have that extraordinary experience going around the corners as the train just leans over and leans back again. But here now, everyone craning to see the start again, to see the locomotive that started it all. Rocket, the greatest of them all. Well, I don't know, the first anyway, the great locomotive. Whose, though, George or Roberts, has always been the great argument. I was brought up as a small boy to talk about George Stephenson's rocket. And when you read the books, of course, they always tell you that Robert built it.
I think there's no real doubt that Robert did the bulk of the building, but you're not going to tell me that George didn't know what was going on. And there was a man called Henry Booth as well, who had a lot to do with the boiler. So let's just say the Stephensons and their staff built it, shall we, and save all argument.
Isn't it look magnificent?
Oh, isn't that great?
I think this one could run up and down, you know, not just for this weekend, but for every weekend of the year, and people would come to see it.
Yes, I think the thing that's nice is how simple it is. Look, just a cylinder and a connecting rod and a piston. None of the flailing rods and levers that the earlier steam engines had.
On this day, in this place, in what, 151 years ago, it would have looked slightly taller, wouldn't it? Because it had a taller chimney there, because they've had to cut a couple of feet off in case it got knocked off by the bridge. Yes,
that's exactly right. When we commissioned the replica, we were told we'd have to have the shorter chimney if we wanted it to run on this occasion.
And it's pulling just one coach. I think they'd hoped for more, but the feeling was that that might be putting too much of a strain on it.
Yes, there's a fairly steep incline to this site, and I think they're playing safe.
Now, I was saying, in terms of the history of the railway, though, it was things like Booth's boiler that were really the step forward, wasn't it?
Yes, Rocket established a type of steam locomotive that stood the test of time. Chimney at the front, boiler in the centre, fire at the back. The only thing that's in the position that we wouldn't recognise now are the cylinders, high up at the back and driving forward to the front wheels. That positioning of the cylinders very rapidly changed, as we shall see when we see Lion coming along shortly.
Timothy Hackworth's Sans Pareil. Now, when Timothy Hackworth's locomotive lost the Triumph, David, did it then disappear, or did they find a job for it?
I think it was given, I think he carried on working for a little while. I must confess not to being a total expert on the history of these very early locomotives. They also seem to have acquired Lion immediately behind it, too.
Now, you see, Lion there indicates very rapidly how quickly railway history develops. After all, what, there's barely 9 years between them, and yet Lion is much more like the kind of train that we would expect to see than Sans Pareil, which I suspect of being shoved anyway.
Well, I don't know about the latter point, Brian, but undoubtedly, I think, as you said in our preliminary programme, Sans Pareil is the end of a line of evolution and wouldn't have got anywhere in terms of its development to the future. Rocket was a new type of, new concept, and nowhere can you see that better in Lion itself, because it really is the same shape as the modern steam locomotive. If you remove all the brass and the trimmings, you've got a modern steam locomotive shape with the cylinders down at the front and the boiler in the middle. Firebox is a bit taller relative to the boiler, but essentially that shape is identifiable in Evening Star.
So we've seen in this cavalcade the whole history of railways, from the first steam locomotive to travel in this country and pull a set of passengers and operate a regular passenger service right up to the most modern. And you can't normally get a history lesson in an hour as rapidly and as colourfully as that.
So there they go.
And as the last train of the cavalcade disappears, a great crowd here will begin to make their way to Rainhill Station, there to wait for modern diesel multiple units, climb aboard and go home to Liverpool or to Manchester and beyond. That's Rocket 150. I hope you've enjoyed it. Perhaps they'll do it again, but they won't do it again in our lifetime. From David and me, goodbye.